Turn off the machines. Your daughter's gonna come out of the coma.
Turn off the machines, your daughter is going to come out of the coma, said the black boy, and what happened next left everyone shocked. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and despair. At the far end of one dimly lit hallway, a boy stood barefoot, his skin dark and his eyes glowing with something no one else could see. He was too small for such a place, too young to carry the weight that pressed on his shoulders, yet he stood tall, unafraid. "Mr. Lancaster," the boy said firmly, his voice echoing against the sterile white walls. "Please don't turn off the machines. Your daughter, she's going to wake up." The crowd of doctors, nurses, and assistants fell silent. Their gazes darted between each other in confusion. Who was this child? How had he gotten in? And why did he speak with such unshakable certainty? Richard Lancaster, one of the wealthiest men in Boston, stood near his daughter's ICU room. His tailored suit was flawless, his posture rigid, his face a mask of control. He had faced world leaders, dismantled corporations, crushed rivals, but in this moment he was simply a father drowning in helplessness. He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Get this kid out of here." Security moved forward, but before their hands touched him, the boy's words froze everyone. "She called me last night," the boy whispered. "She asked me to save you." A shiver ran through the hallway. Inside the ICU, the steady beeping of machines filled the silence. Emily Lancaster lay still, tubes wrapped around her fragile body, like threads holding her to the world. The monitor's cold blue glow reflected on her pale face. She was only 17, but her body looked drained, as if life itself had already given up on her. Richard sat beside her bed, his hands clenched into fists, his suit rumpled from sleepless nights. For once, the man who owned skyscrapers and commanded empires looked small, powerless. Across town, in a cramped church shelter in Roxbury, a boy named Imani woke with a gasp. Sweat dripped down his forehead. His heart hammered as though warning him of something urgent. The dream had returned. Not an ordinary dream, but a vision, as sharp and real as breathing. A girl in the darkness calling to him, not with words, but with her soul. "She needs me," he whispered to himself. Imani was only 12, thin, barefoot, with eyes far too old for his age. He had grown up in that shelter, raised by people who owned little but gave him everything they had: kindness, food, love. Some whispered he was different, a child marked by something divine. After surviving an illness as a newborn that should have killed him, people said he could feel things others could not. He sometimes heard voices, sometimes sensed pain before seeing it, but never had he felt something this strong. He slipped into an old flannel shirt, pulled on his torn sneakers, and tiptoed past the rows of sleeping children. Just as he reached the church steps, Pastor David emerged from his office. "Where are you going at this hour, son?" Imani didn't hesitate. "To the hospital, to her. She called me. She doesn't want to die." The pastor stared at him for a long moment. Then he simply nodded. "Go, but be careful. And remember, you're not just talking to her. You're carrying her hope." Imani swallowed hard, then stepped into the night. The streets of Boston were still cloaked in darkness as Imani ran. His small frame cut through the night, dodging traffic, splashing through puddles left by the evening rain. Each step pounded against the pavement like a drumbeat, his lungs burning, but his determination pulling him forward. By the time he reached the glowing entrance of St. Catherine's Hospital, sweat soaked his flannel shirt. 2 security guards spotted him immediately. "You lost, kid?" one asked, his voice sharp but curious. "No," Imani replied, breathless but steady. "I need to get upstairs. It's important." The guards exchanged a glance. "Not without a parent, you're not." While one guard spoke into his radio, Imani acted on instinct. He darted past them, slipping through the automatic doors before they could catch him. His heart pounded harder, not from fear, but from urgency. He knew this hospital well. The church's flower ministry often delivered small bouquets to patients on weekends, and he had memorized the service staircases, the hidden corners. Without hesitation, he raced up 7 flights of stairs, lungs burning, until he reached the ICU floor. Room 706. The door was slightly ajar, just as he had seen it in his dream. He pushed it open gently. The room was dim, filled with the rhythmic hum of machines. Emily lay there, her face pale and still, her chest rising and falling with the help of the ventilator. For a moment Imani simply stood frozen, staring at her. Then softly he whispered, "Emily, I'm here, like you asked." He reached for her hand. His eyes closed. The world seemed to fall silent. And then it came. That presence again. Warm, familiar, like a soul fighting to hold on. "You don't want to die," he said under his breath, "but your father, he's giving up. You called me because you still believe." Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Imani's eyes shot open. Richard Lancaster walked in, coffee cup in hand. He stopped cold when he saw the boy at his daughter's bedside, holding her hand. Fury rose in his chest. "What the hell are you doing here?" Richard's voice was low, dangerous. Imani turned slowly. His voice was steady, almost calm. "I came to save her." For a long moment, the room seemed frozen in time. Richard stared, unable to comprehend how this boy, this nobody, had slipped past security and was now speaking with such certainty. Then the spell broke. Security stormed in, grabbing Imani by the arms. But even as they pulled him away, his words didn't falter. "She spoke to me," he said, his eyes locked on Richard. "She asked me to help. She doesn't want to go." Richard's jaw clenched. His rational mind screamed delusion, yet something inside him wavered. Still, he forced the words out. "Get him out of here." The guards shoved Imani toward the hallway. He didn't cry. He didn't struggle. He simply turned his head toward Emily's window and whispered, "I'm not giving up on you, even if he does." Inside, Richard stood over his daughter, the boy's words gnawing at his mind. He hated himself for even considering them. Yet when he looked down at Emily's pale face, the silence around her felt heavier than ever. For the first time, the billionaire wondered, what if the boy wasn't wrong? Richard Lancaster left the hospital late that night, the boy's words echoing in his mind like a stubborn melody he couldn't silence. For the first time in days, he went back to his Beacon Hill mansion, but the place felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. He poured himself a glass of scotch, his hands trembling ever so slightly. On the mantel sat a framed photograph of Emily and her mother, Elaine, smiling in a field of wildflowers. Richard stared at it until his throat tightened. He slammed the drink back in one swallow, but the burn did nothing to ease the ache inside him. His phone buzzed. A message from the hospital. Final neurological evaluation scheduled for 7 a.m. Withdrawal of life support will proceed after consent. Richard hurled the phone across the room. It hit the wall with a sickening crack, the screen shattering into pieces. He pressed his palms against his eyes, but the boy's voice wouldn't leave him. "She doesn't want to go." Across the city, on the roof of the Roxbury Church shelter, Imani sat cross-legged beneath the stars. The night was cool, the city humming faintly below, but his heart was heavy. Pastor David climbed up the creaky ladder and joined him. "You still believe she's coming back?" "I don't believe," Imani whispered, his voice steady but sad. "I know." "Then why do you look so broken?" the pastor asked gently. "Because he's going to kill her before she gets the chance." David placed a hand on the boy's thin shoulder. His eyes glimmered with something deeper than doubt, faith. Sometimes God plants a seed in the desert and waits for someone to water it. Maybe that someone is you. Imani said nothing, but his chest ached with the weight of the words. The next morning, before dawn, he slipped into the church basement greenhouse. Rows of flowers thrived under dim grow lights, cared for by the church's elders and children alike. Reverend Martha, the woman who had first shown Imani how to nurture them, often said, "Flowers are just silent prayers." Today, he carefully picked a single white camellia, fragile yet strong, hope in bloom. Martha entered quietly, watching him place the flower in a glass jar. "This one's for her," she asked softly. Imani nodded. "She listens to me." The Reverend didn't question him. She had long since stopped doubting the boy who seemed more attuned to the unseen than anyone she had ever known. Later that morning, the church's flower ministry gathered to deliver small arrangements to hospital patients. It was Imani's perfect chance to slip back inside unnoticed. When the group reached the 7th floor, he quietly drifted away, moving with steps so soft they barely touched the ground. Room 706 waited for him, the door slightly ajar. He slipped inside. Emily lay there as before, pale, motionless, but not empty. The air felt charged, as though her presence lingered just beyond the veil. "I brought you something," Imani whispered, placing the white camellia by her bedside. "It means hope." He sat down, brushing her hand lightly with his fingers. "I came back, even after what your father did. I'm not mad. He's just scared. People who stop believing usually are." He leaned closer. "I think you miss her. Your mom. I lost mine too. I don't remember her face, just her voice humming some song I never figured out." He swallowed hard, then stood and walked into the hallway, where an old, upright piano sat against the wall. Closing his eyes, he began to play. The melody was delicate, unfamiliar, yet it felt like it had always existed. Inside room 706, the heart monitor flickered. A single spike, small but undeniable. Nurse Angela, passing by, froze in the doorway. Her eyes darted between the monitor and the boy at the piano. Something inside her whispered, "This isn't a coincidence." Nurse Angela lingered in the hallway, her hand gripping the doorframe as she watched the boy play. His small hands moved over the keys with a kind of raw sincerity that no lesson could ever teach. The notes drifted into room 706, weaving with the steady hum of the machines. And then the monitor spiked again. Angela's pulse quickened. She stepped inside quietly, pretending to check the equipment. The other nurses would call it a fluke, but her instincts told her otherwise. She scribbled a note on her clipboard, her eyes never leaving the faint rise on the screen. Back at the piano, Imani's eyes were closed, his body swaying with the music. It was as though he wasn't playing the piano at all, but reaching for something beyond it, something only he could hear. When the final chord faded, silence returned. He opened his eyes slowly, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. Angela approached him cautiously. "That was beautiful," she said softly. Imani gave a shy nod but said nothing. "Do you play often?" she asked, her tone careful, as if she didn't want to break the spell. "Only when someone needs it," he murmured. Then, without another word, he slipped out of the ICU before security could notice. Angela glanced back at Emily. Her pale lips seemed a shade less colorless. A flicker of warmth touched her cheeks. Angela couldn't shake the thought, something is happening here. Meanwhile, across the city, Richard sat in a boardroom surrounded by executives and charts, but he couldn't hear a single word. His mind kept circling back to the boy, the flower, the piano, the insane notion that Emily could hear him. For the first time in years, Richard Lancaster, the man who never hesitated to make billion-dollar decisions, found himself paralyzed by doubt. That night, when the hospital corridors had emptied and the city lights glowed like distant stars, Imani returned. He carried another flower, a small red Christmas cactus. Reverend Martha had told him it symbolized rebirth. Perfect, he thought. He placed it gently on Emily's nightstand. "This one's for new beginnings," he whispered. Her hand twitched, barely a movement, but enough to make his breath catch. "You moved," he whispered, eyes widening. "I saw it." His chest tightened with hope. He rushed back to the piano, his fingers trembling as they touched the keys. This time the song was different, fuller, richer. It felt less like a melody and more like a call, a beacon cutting through the fog. Inside the room, the monitor blipped again. Angela, who had been quietly observing from the hall, pressed her hand to her mouth. Her eyes darted from the machine to Emily's hand, which trembled ever so slightly. Then came the sound of footsteps, Sharp, heavy, familiar. Richard Lancaster rounded the corner. His face darkened when he saw the boy again, seated at the piano. "You again?" he barked. Imani stopped playing and looked up. His expression was calm, almost unshaken. Richard's fury boiled over. "What the hell do you think you're doing here? Sneaking around, playing games in a hospital? Who let you in?" Imani rose slowly, his small frame dwarfed by Richard's towering presence. "I was playing for her," he said quietly. "This is not your place," Richard thundered. "You think you can fix everything with a piano? With flowers?" "I think she hears me," Imani replied. Richard's voice rose, sharp as glass. "You're nothing but a street kid with fantasies. You don't belong here." Imani's hands tightened at his sides, but his voice didn't break. "She doesn't want to die. I felt it. But she's waiting for you." Angela stepped forward, her tone firm. "Sir, he isn't hurting her. I've seen it myself. She reacts when he plays." Richard turned on her. "Reacting? You want me to gamble my daughter's life on this nonsense?" Angela didn't flinch. Sometimes what the heart feels matters more than what the machines say. For the first time, Richard hesitated. His eyes flickered back to Emily. Something inside him cracked. Imani's words fell like a quiet thunder. "No," he said softly. "She's not waiting for me. She's saving you." Rain fell gently over Boston that night, the streets slick with silver reflections. Inside St. Catherine's Hospital, the air carried a tension so heavy it seemed to seep through the walls. Room 706 was quiet, but charged, as though something unseen lingered there. Richard stood outside the glass window, his arms crossed tightly, staring at his daughter's fragile form. He looked like a fortress crumbling from within. Dr. Munro approached, his expression solemn, flanked by a hospital social worker and the legal advisor. "Mr. Lancaster," Munro began softly, "we've completed the final neurological evaluation. There's no remaining brain activity. The protocol is clear. We need your consent to begin the withdrawal process." The words pressed against Richard like chains. His jaw tightened. The doctor's voice droned on, but Richard barely heard him. All he could see was Emily, pale against the sheets, her hand limp in the glow of the monitor. "We understand how difficult this is," Munro continued gently, "but letting go, it's an act of mercy now." Richard gave a small nod, his throat dry. He picked up the pen on the clipboard, his hand hovering. For a moment the room blurred around him. Then he spoke, his voice hollow. "Give me until 7 a.m. tomorrow." The doctors exchanged glances, then agreed quietly before leaving him alone with Emily. Richard sank into the chair beside her bed. He took her hand in his, feeling how fragile, how impossibly light it was. His thumb traced her fingers, fingers that once danced across piano keys, filling the house with music. "You'd hate me for this, wouldn't you?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "You always believed in magic, in impossible things. And I buried all of it, told you to stop dreaming, told you to grow up." He bowed his head, tears finally breaking free. "And now, I'd give anything to believe again." Across town, in the silent chapel of the Roxbury Church, Imani lay restless on his cot. Sleep wouldn't come. The storm outside howled against the stained glass, rattling the old wooden beams. His chest ached. He knew, he felt it, that tomorrow they would end it. Unless he did something. He sat up suddenly, his breath sharp in his lungs. Quietly, he slipped out of the room and made his way to the greenhouse in the basement. The moonlight filtered in faintly, glimmering across the leaves and petals. His small hands reached for a white orchid, delicate, rare, almost glowing in the dim light. Reverend Martha appeared behind him, her face shadowed with worry. "You're not sleeping." "No," Imani whispered. "They're going to do it. They're going to turn the machines off." Martha didn't argue. She simply placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Then go. Take your faith with you." And so, barefoot and trembling, Imani ran into the storm. Rain soaked through his shirt and clung to his skin, but he didn't stop. The orchid was tucked safely beneath his coat, shielded from the wind and water. At 6 a.m., Richard returned to the hospital. The corridors were quiet, the world not yet awake. He sat by Emily's bed, the pen and paper waiting on the table beside him. His eyes were hollow, his hands heavy. Angela entered softly, carrying a cup of tea. "You should warm up a little," she said. "I'm beyond warm," Richard muttered. His voice was low, almost broken. "I'm hollow." Angela didn't push. Instead, she asked, "Do you believe in miracles?" Richard stared at her, his lips pressed tight. "I don't know how anymore." Angela's eyes softened. "Then believe in what people are brave enough to fight for." Before Richard could respond, the ICU doors swung open with a crash. Soaked from the rain, breathing hard, stood Imani. In his hands, still glowing faintly in the fluorescent light, was the white orchid. 2 security guards immediately moved toward the dripping boy, but Angela stepped in front of them, her tone sharp with authority. "He's with me," she said firmly. "Let him speak." The guards hesitated, uncertain. Richard sat frozen, staring at the boy as though time itself had stopped. Imani's clothes clung to his thin frame, his hair plastered to his forehead, but in his hands he cradled the orchid like a sacred offering. The room grew unbearably quiet as he stepped forward. He placed the flower gently beside Emily's heart monitor, its white petals luminous against the cold metal. Then he reached for her hand. "They're going to let you go today, aren't they?" he whispered, his voice trembling but steady enough to pierce the silence. No one answered. They didn't need to. "I know you're still here," he continued, his eyes locked on Emily's pale face. "You moved your finger. You cried. I saw it." Richard's chest tightened, his jaw clenching. "This is madness," he muttered under his breath. But Imani turned to him, his gaze unwavering. "You don't have to believe me, but you owe her one more day, one more chance." Richard swallowed hard. The boy's eyes weren't pleading. They were certain. They burned with a truth Richard wasn't ready to face. His hand hovered over the clipboard, the pen shaking between his fingers. "I'm not a man of faith," Richard admitted softly, his voice raw. "Maybe not," Imani replied, "but you were once a man who loved someone who was. That still counts." The words hit Richard like a blow. His mind raced back to Elaine, his wife, Emily's mother, the woman who had believed in impossible things until her very last breath. Across town, as dawn broke through storm clouds, Imani's exhaustion caught up with him. After leaving the hospital briefly, he stumbled into the quiet church chapel, collapsing onto the cold tile floor. Somewhere between thought and sleep, the dream came again. It wasn't like his other dreams. This one was sharper, realer. He stood in a field of mist where time seemed to stop. The sky was grey, endless. And then Emily appeared, not weak or pale, but standing tall, glowing faintly. Yet her eyes carried a sadness too deep for words. "Imani," she said, her voice echoing inside his chest like a wind. "You're trapped," he whispered. "Yes," she replied softly, "but not because of me. Because of him." "Your father," Imani said. She nodded. "He gave up. He stopped hearing me. He closed the door." Imani stepped closer, desperate. "You called me for a reason. Tell me what I have to do." Emily's face wavered in the mist, fading like smoke. "Tell him not to sign the paper. Tell him I still have something to say." "What do you need to say?" he begged. But her image blurred, her voice thinning into silence. "You'll know when the time comes, but hurry. If he signs, I'll be gone." Imani jolted awake, his chest heaving. The storm outside still raged, thunder rumbling through the night. He clutched the orchid to his chest, his pulse racing. He had no time left to wait. At the same moment Imani woke with a start in the church, Richard Lancaster stood alone in his Beacon Hill study. The rain lashed against tall windows, lightning flashing across the skyline. On his desk lay the form, one signature away from ending his daughter's life. He picked up the pen, his hand trembling. Again and again he tried to steady himself, but each time his grip faltered. He closed his eyes. Memories rose unbidden. The night Emily was born, Elaine holding their newborn daughter close. Richard remembered the warmth of her voice as she whispered, "If she ever gets lost, promise me you'll believe in her, even if the world doesn't." He had never spoken that promise aloud, but it echoed now, louder than the storm outside. At 6:45 a.m., Richard arrived back at the hospital, the form tucked into his briefcase, his face pale and drawn. Nurse Angela met him in the hallway. "Are you ready, Mr. Lancaster?" she asked carefully. Before he could answer, the sound of running footsteps filled the corridor. "Wait!" Everyone turned. Imani came skidding to a halt, drenched from the rain, his chest heaving, his face pale with exhaustion, but burning with urgency. "Please," he gasped. "You can't do this yet." Security reached for him, but Angela raised her voice. "Let him speak." Richard froze, torn between fury and something else he couldn't name. He turned toward the boy. Imani stepped closer, dripping water onto the sterile floor. His voice shook, but not from fear. "She came to me," he said. "She's not gone, but she's waiting for you to let go of something." Richard's heart thudded. "Let go of what?" "She's waiting for you to tell the truth," Imani whispered, his eyes locking onto Richard's. "The truth you've buried, the truth that keeps her in the dark." Richard staggered a step back, his throat tight. He knew exactly what the boy meant. He had carried that truth like a stone in his chest, pretending it didn't exist. The ICU clock ticked steadily, 6:57 a.m. The world seemed to hold its breath. Inside room 706, Emily lay motionless, machines humming around her, the team of doctors waiting. The consent form sat ready on the table, the pen resting beside it. Richard stood at her side, staring at her still face, the boy's words gnawing at him. "This isn't your daughter," Richard said hoarsely, turning to Imani. "You don't know what it's like." "I do," Imani cut in, his small voice slicing through the air. "I know what it's like to have the world decide your value without ever asking what's left inside you." The words struck Richard like a thunderclap. His chest tightened, his defenses cracking. Angela stepped forward. "I've seen her react when he plays. It may not show on the charts, but it's real." Dr. Monroe shook his head. "We must be guided by science. Since when does science explain tears?" Angela snapped, her eyes burning. "Since when does it explain the soul?" Silence fell, heavier than stone. All eyes turned to Richard. The clock ticked again, 6:58 a.m. Richard's voice broke as he whispered to Imani, "What is she waiting for me to say?" Imani's gaze didn't waver. "She's waiting for you to stop lying." Richard's heart pounded in his chest because he knew exactly which lie the boy meant. The ICU clock ticked like a drumbeat, 6:59 a.m. The air in room 706 was thick, every breath heavy with expectation. Nurses stood frozen, doctors held their clipboards, and Richard Lancaster's hand hovered over the form that would decide everything. Imani stood at the piano just outside the room. His fingers touched the keys gently, almost reverently, and then the sound filled the hallway. Slow, heavy notes that carried more than music. They carried memory, grief, and hope intertwined. Richard's knees buckled. He fell beside Emily's bed, clutching her hand as if it were the last tether to his soul. His tears fell freely now, no longer hidden behind the armor of power and pride. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of years unspoken. "I should have protected you. I should have believed in you." A gasp rippled through the room. Emily's finger twitched, then again. Angela's eyes widened. "Look, her hand." The heart monitor beeped faster, its rhythm no longer flat and steady but alive, pulsing. The EEG machine lit up with faint sparks of brain activity. Dr. Monroe leaned in, stunned. That's impossible." "No," Angela said, her voice trembling but firm. "That's Imani." Richard clung to Emily's hand as her eyelids fluttered, her lips parted ever so slightly, and a faint sound escaped, not words, but intention. "She's responding," Angela whispered, rushing to the monitors. "There's a spike in her cortex. She's fighting her way back." The ICU erupted in chaos. Nurses shouted instructions, technicians adjusted wires, and doctors scrambled to record what their instruments could barely comprehend. Richard's tears turned to laughter, raw, broken, disbelieving. He pressed his forehead to Emily's hand. "Baby, I'm here. I'll never give up again." And then her eyes opened. Weak, trembling, unfocused, but open. The world seemed to stop. Richard gasped, choking on his breath. "Emily?" Her gaze shifted slowly, hazy but searching. Her lips moved, her voice a whisper. "Daddy." Richard broke completely, sobbing as he pulled her hand to his face. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." Through the chaos, Imani stopped playing. He sat quietly at the piano, his small hands resting on the keys, his eyes calm. It was as if he had always known this moment would come. Richard turned to him, his voice shaking. How did you know?" Imani reached into his soaked coat and pulled out a folded, worn piece of paper. He handed it to Richard with steady hands. Richard unfolded it. A newspaper clipping yellowed with age. A photo of Elaine, his wife, holding baby Emily in her arms, smiling as if nothing in the world could harm them. Richard's throat tightened. "Where did you get this?" Imani's voice was quiet, steady. "She saved me." Richard's eyes snapped up. "What do you mean?" "I was left in a hospital when I was born," Imani explained. "No name, no family. They said I wouldn't survive. But she came, your wife. She visited me every day, held me, called me Imani, said it meant faith." Richard staggered back, his knees nearly giving way. "Elaine, she never told me." "She didn't need to," Imani said softly. "She left it in me. And now I've brought it back to you." Richard pressed the clipping to his chest, his tears flowing anew. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought he had lost forever. Faith. The ICU had become a whirlwind of motion. Nurses checked vitals. Doctors scribbled frantically on charts. Machines beeped with rhythms no one had dared hope for just hours before. Yet, in the middle of it all, Richard knelt at his daughter's bedside, his hand wrapped around hers as though letting go would undo the miracle. Emily's eyelids fluttered again. This time, her eyes lingered open longer, their hazy blue shifting slowly from confusion to recognition. She turned her head ever so slightly, her weak gaze resting on the boy standing near the piano. Her lips trembled, her voice faint, but clear enough. "Imani." The name fell into the room like a bell toll, silencing everything. Richard's breath caught. He looked from his daughter to the boy. You know him?" Emily's lips curled into the faintest smile. "He was with me, in the dark. He brought me home." Angela pressed her hand to her chest, her eyes wet. Even the skeptical doctors exchanged glances, their disbelief shaken by what they had just heard. Richard turned back to the boy, his voice thick. "She remembers you." Imani stepped forward slowly, almost timidly. His small hand reached for Emily's. She stretched out her weak fingers, and when their hands met, her pale face softened with peace. "I heard your music," she whispered. "It lit up the darkness. I wasn't alone anymore." Richard swallowed hard, his chest tight with gratitude and guilt tangled together. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but his voice failed him. Later that day, as Emily rested under close watch, Richard found Imani sitting quietly in the hospital garden. The boy held the wilted orchid in his lap, stroking its petals gently, as though even in its fading, it still mattered. Richard sat beside him, the silence stretching long before he spoke. "You said my wife saved you. Tell me more." Imani's eyes stayed fixed on the flower. "I was born sick. My mother died giving birth. No name, no family. The doctor said I wouldn't last. But she came. Elaine." He smiled faintly at the memory. "Every day she brought me flowers. She played piano in the hallway, sang softly, and she whispered to me, "You're a promise. One day you'll help someone who stopped believing." Richard's throat tightened. His hands trembled as he rubbed his face. "She never told me. She only once said she visited a baby, but she didn't tell me it was you." Imani finally looked up at him. I didn't know her name until years later, but I never forgot her face. When I saw the newspaper clipping of Emily's accident, I recognized her instantly. He pulled the folded clipping from his pocket again, placing it into Richard's hands. "She gave me a name, Imani. She said it meant faith, and I've held on to it ever since." Richard stared at the boy, his chest aching with something he hadn't felt in years: awe, reverence, gratitude. "You were the child," he whispered. "The promise." Imani nodded softly. "And I came back for yours." The sun dipped low over Boston, painting the hospital windows in amber light. Emily slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, her monitors steady, her breathing stronger. Doctors called it a medical anomaly, but whispers of the word miracle passed quietly from nurse to nurse. Richard walked slowly through the hospital garden with Imani at his side. The boy's steps were quiet, deliberate, as though each one carried more weight than his small frame should bear. They stopped at a stone bench beneath an old oak tree. Richard lowered himself onto it, running a hand down his tired face. His voice came out rough, broken. "I spent years building walls," he confessed, "hiding behind money, logic, control. My wife, she loved the impossible. I called it foolishness, but now I see it saved both our lives." Imani sat beside him, placing the wilted orchid on his lap. "She didn't see people for who they were," he said softly. "She saw them for who they could become." Richard's eyes stung as he looked at the boy. "Do you have anyone?" "Family." "Just the church. Reverend Martha, Pastor David, the kids." Richard hesitated. The next words trembled on his lips. Would you let me become your family?" Imani's head turned sharply. His eyes widened, searching Richard's face for the truth behind the offer. "You mean like... officially?" "Yes." Richard's voice broke. "Legally. Not as a favor. Not out of pity, but as a father." The boy was silent, stunned. His small fingers tightened on the flower in his lap. "Only if..." he began carefully. "Only if I can still play music, and grow flowers, and keep believing weird things." For the first time in months, Richard laughed, a raw, unpolished laugh that shook with both sorrow and joy. I'd expect nothing less. Weeks passed. Emily's progress astonished the medical world. She regained movement, then speech, then the strength to walk again, slowly, but surely. With every step, Richard's heart healed a little more, and with every note Imani played, the mansion that had once felt like a tomb filled with life again. The Lancaster home changed. A piano was moved into the center of the living room. Flowers lined the halls. Laughter echoed where silence once suffocated. One morning, Richard walked through the garden with Imani. They stopped at the base of an old tree, its branches stretching proudly to the sky. "Elaine planted this the year Emily was born," Richard said quietly. "She told me it would outlive us all." They stood together in silence, the memory hanging between them. Then Richard turned to the boy. His voice was gentle, almost hesitant. "What is your real name? The one you were given?" Imani's eyes softened. "Noah. That's what they called me when I was found. But your wife, she gave me my real name." Richard waited, breath held. "She called me Imani, said it meant faith. Because when the world stopped believing, she didn't." Richard placed a trembling hand on the boy's shoulder. His voice broke. "Then I'm proud to call you my son, and proud to carry the name she gave you." For the first time, the boy's guarded eyes filled with tears, not of pain, but of belonging. A month later, the world beyond the Lancaster home had taken notice. News outlets reported cautiously on Emily's recovery, calling it astonishing and beyond medical explanation. But inside the house, labels didn't matter. What mattered was life, breathing, laughing, playing. Emily had taken to the piano again, though her fingers were still weak. She would sit beside Imani, watching as he coaxed melodies out of the keys. Sometimes she tried to join him, fumbling at first, but he always smiled patiently, guiding her until the notes began to flow again. "You play like you've been doing it for 100 years, she told him one afternoon, her voice light but filled with awe. He shrugged. "It's not about playing, it's about listening." "Listening to what?" she asked. "To the parts of people they forget to show." Emily blinked at him, the weight of his words sinking deeper than any explanation she'd ever been given. Richard often stood at the doorway during those moments, his chest swelling with gratitude he didn't know how to express. He had spent a lifetime chasing numbers, wealth, and power. Now, all he wanted was to protect these fragile, miraculous moments. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Richard raised his glass. His voice shook as he spoke. "I used to think strength was about control, about never bending, never breaking. But you," he looked at Emily, then at Imani, "you've shown me that strength is about faith, about love, about letting yourself believe in things you can't measure." The table grew quiet, the weight of his confession pressing against the room. Emily's eyes softened, and she reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "That's the dad I've been waiting for," she whispered. Later that week, a delivery truck pulled up in front of the Roxbury church. Workers carefully unloaded a brand-new upright piano, polished and gleaming. The children in the shelter crowded around in awe, their eyes wide. A note was taped to the instrument. No signature, no explanation, just 5 simple words. "For the next promise." Reverend Martha wiped her eyes as she read it aloud. Then she turned to the children. "This piano is for every one of you who feels unheard, because sometimes music speaks when we can't." Back at the mansion, Emily's laughter rang through the halls again. She had grown stronger, her steps steadier. Richard found himself walking with a lighter heart, no longer haunted by the silence that once suffocated the house. One night, he joined Imani in the garden. The boy was kneeling by the flowers, gently watering them as though each bloom carried a secret. Richard stood for a while before finally asking, "Do you think miracles happen every day, or only when we're desperate enough to see them?" Imani didn't look up. "They happen every day. We just forget to notice." Richard let the words sink in, the night air cool against his skin. For the first time in decades, he felt at peace. Not because everything made sense, but because he had finally stopped demanding that it had to. 2 weeks later, Emily was strong enough to leave the hospital. The day she walked out, leaning lightly on Richard's arm, the lobby erupted in quiet applause from the nurses and staff who had witnessed the unexplainable. Cameras had been forbidden, but whispers spread through the city. About the girl in room 706, about the boy who played music, about a father who almost lost everything but found faith instead. Back at the mansion, the return felt surreal. The home that had once been filled with emptiness now welcomed Emily with warmth. Fresh flowers lined the entry hall. A grand piano sat waiting in the living room. The silence that had haunted the house was gone. That evening, Emily sat at the piano bench with Imani beside her. She touched the keys softly as though afraid they might break. "I dreamed of this," she said quietly. "In the dark, when I couldn't move, I heard music. I thought it was memory, but it was you." Imani's lips curved into the faintest smile. "You heard yourself too." "I only reminded you." Richard stood nearby, listening, every word pressing deeper into him than he could admit. Later, as the 3 of them walked through the garden, Emily paused at the old oak tree her mother had planted. Her fingers brushed the rough bark. "Mum loved this tree. She said it was proof that roots matter more than branches." Richard's throat tightened. He could almost hear Elaine's voice in the wind, soft and certain. Emily turned to Imani. "Did she really save you?" He nodded. "Yes. She called me a promise. She said one day I'd have to bring faith back to someone who lost it." Emily looked at her father. His eyes shone with tears, but for once they weren't tears of despair. Days turned into weeks. Emily's strength returned little by little, each step in therapy a victory. Imani stayed close, his music filling the house, his flowers brightening every corner. One afternoon, Richard called him into the study. The boy entered cautiously, holding a small pot of daisies, Emily's favorite. Richard cleared his throat, his voice steady but tender. "I've spoken with the lawyers. I want to adopt you officially." Imani froze, the flower pot trembling slightly in his hands. "You mean, like a real family?" "Yes," Richard said firmly. "Not out of charity. Not because I owe you, but because you are my son." For a long moment, Imani couldn't speak. His eyes filled with tears he fought to hold back. Finally, he whispered, "Then I want to carry her name. The one she gave me. Imani. Faith." Richard's chest swelled with pride and sorrow all at once. He crossed the room and embraced the boy, his voice breaking. "Then faith is what we'll live by." Outside, the garden seemed to bloom brighter than ever. By autumn, Emily had regained much of her strength. Though her steps were still careful, her laughter carried through the mansion like sunlight breaking through clouds. The Lancaster estate, once sterile and silent, now pulsed with life. Reporters clamored for interviews, desperate to understand the miracle of room 706. Doctors offered cautious explanations about rare brain activity and unexplained responses, but none of it captured the truth. Inside the mansion, Richard guarded their story fiercely. He knew some things weren't meant to be dissected by headlines. They were meant to be cherished. One Saturday morning, Emily insisted on visiting the church in Roxbury. "I want to see where he came from," she told her father, glancing at Imani. The three of them arrived to a flurry of excitement. Children ran up to hug Imani, clinging to his shirt and tugging at his hands. Reverend Martha embraced him warmly, her eyes glistening when she saw Emily standing there alive and smiling. "This house of God has seen many prayers," Martha whispered, "but few have walked through its doors carrying the answer with them." Emily blushed, gripping Imani's arm for balance. "You kept me alive," she said. Imani shook his head. "No, you kept yourself alive. I only held the light while you found the way." Later, in the church sanctuary, Emily sat at the new piano, the one delivered weeks ago with the unsigned note. Her fingers trembled as they pressed the keys, the music shaky at first, but soon flowing. Children gathered around, listening in awe. Richard watched from the back pew, his heart swelling. For the first time he felt proud not of money, not of power, but of faith. Faith born from his wife's love, carried by a boy, and reborn in his daughter's hands. That evening, as the three of them walked back into the city, Emily turned to her father. "You know people will never stop asking about me, right?" Richard sighed. "I know, but you don't owe anyone an explanation." She smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But maybe someone out there needs to hear that giving up isn't the end, that even in the darkest place hope can find you." Her words pierced Richard's heart like an arrow of truth. He saw in her not only his daughter, but also Elaine's spirit, unyielding, luminous. That night back in the mansion, Richard stood with Imani in the garden. The boy watered the flowers quietly, the moonlight casting silver across his face. "Do you ever wonder why it had to be you?" Richard asked softly. Imani didn't look up. "All the time, but then I remember she chose me. Not because I was strong, but because I was broken. Broken things know how to see what others can't." Richard swallowed hard, his throat aching with emotion. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then maybe broken things are the ones who save us." The night grew still, the flowers swaying gently as though agreeing. Winter crept into Boston with its biting wind and grey skies, but inside the Lancaster mansion, warmth blossomed like spring. Emily's strength continued to return. She practiced walking through the halls, each step steadier than the last, while Imani often walked beside her, humming softly, keeping rhythm with her movements. One evening, Richard hosted a small gathering at the house, not for business associates, but for the staff, the church family, and the hospital workers who had stood by them. The dining room, once a space of cold formality, now glowed with candles and laughter. Angela, the nurse who had fought for Imani to be heard, sat at the table with tears in her eyes as she watched Emily raise a toast with trembling but determined hands. "To life," Emily said simply. Her voice wavered, but her smile was radiant. Everyone echoed the words, glasses clinking, hearts full. After dinner, Emily joined Imani at the piano. Together they played a duet, her hands uncertain but determined, his steady and guiding. The notes filled the house like a prayer answered in music. Richard stood near the fireplace, his chest swelling with a pride he never thought he'd feel again. This was no boardroom victory, no financial conquest. This was something far greater. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the house had fallen into a hush, Richard found himself unable to sleep. He wandered into Emily's room. She was resting peacefully, her breathing even. Imani sat nearby in a chair, half asleep, a flower pot balanced carefully on his lap. Richard smiled faintly. He stepped into the hallway, where the quiet pressed in like a blanket. For a long while he simply leaned against the wall, staring at nothing. Then he whispered, "Elaine, you were right. About everything." The next morning, Richard drove with Imani back to Roxbury. Snow flurries danced in the air, settling on the cracked sidewalks. The church glowed faintly through the mist. Inside, Reverend Martha greeted them warmly. She placed her hands on Imani's shoulders. "So, is it true?" she asked softly. "Has this man truly opened his heart?" Imani smiled. "Yes, he wants me to be his son." Tears welled in the old woman's eyes. She turned to Richard. "Then you are not just saving him. You are saving yourself." Richard nodded, his throat tight. "He's already saved me." Before they left, Richard walked to the new piano sitting proudly in the chapel. He pressed one key, then another, the sound echoing through the sanctuary. His fingers were clumsy, but his heart felt lighter. Imani watched him with a small smile. "You're learning to listen," he said. Richard chuckled quietly. "Maybe for the first time in my life." As they stepped back into the cold air, Richard glanced down at the boy walking beside him. Snowflakes caught in Imani's hair, making him look almost luminous against the grey. In that moment, Richard no longer saw him as a stranger, or even as a miracle. He saw him as family. The snow deepened as December unfolded. Boston streets glimmered with holiday lights, storefronts decorated with wreaths and garlands. For the first time in years, the Lancaster mansion also reflected the season. A towering Christmas tree stood in the great hall, decorated not by staff but by Richard, Emily and Imani together. Emily placed the final ornament near the top, a delicate glass star her mother had cherished. She balanced carefully on her father's arm as she reached for the branch. "There," she said with a triumphant smile. "Just like Mom used to do." Richard's eyes glistened. "She would be proud of you, Emily." "And of you," Emily added gently. "You finally let her magic back into the house." Later that night, as carols played softly in the background, Imani sat at the piano. His music flowed like a river, carrying the warmth of the season into every corner of the mansion. Emily hummed along, her voice thin but sweet. Richard sat nearby, holding a cup of cocoa instead of scotch, marveling at how different everything felt. The boy's music wasn't just sound, it was healing. Afterward, Emily asked, "Can we visit Mom's grave tomorrow?" Richard hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, we should." The next morning they bundled up in heavy coats and scarves. The sky was grey, the air sharp with winter's bite. Together they walked through the quiet cemetery until they reached Elaine's resting place. Emily knelt carefully in the snow, brushing it away from the stone. Her hand lingered on the engraved name. "Hi, Mom," she whispered. "I'm still here. Because you sent him." Imani stepped forward shyly, holding a small white lily. He placed it at the base of the stone. "Thank you," he said softly, "for giving me a name, for giving me faith." Richard stood behind them, silent for a long moment. Then he lowered himself to his knees. His hand rested on the cold stone as his voice cracked. "Elaine, I failed you. I stopped believing. I let the world make me hard. But you You left me a gift I never deserved. A boy, a promise. I'll spend the rest of my life honoring that." Tears blurred his vision, but for once he didn't hide them. Emily leaned against him, her arm looped through his. Imani placed his small hand over Richard's. For a moment, the three of them knelt together, bound not just by grief but by a love that had outlasted even death. As they walked away, snow falling gently around them, Emily whispered, "It feels like she's still here." "She is," Richard said quietly. "In you, in him, in everything she touched." That night, back at the mansion, the fire crackled warmly. Richard looked at the boy seated at the piano, Emily curled beside him. For the first time, he no longer feared tomorrow. He finally understood what Elaine had always tried to teach him. Faith was never about certainty. It was about choosing to believe anyway. The new year arrived with fireworks that lit up Boston's skyline. For Richard, it marked more than just the turning of a calendar. It was the beginning of a new life. Emily's recovery continued, though slowly. Each step in her therapy felt like a miracle, each smile a gift. But what surprised Richard most was how naturally Imani became part of their family. It was as though he had always belonged, his laughter echoing through the mansion, his quiet presence bringing balance. One evening, Richard found himself in the library, surrounded by books he hadn't touched in years. He was searching, not for financial strategies or legal texts, but for answers about faith, about life, about things he had ignored for so long. Imani wandered in quietly, carrying a small pot of violets. He placed it on the table and sat down across from Richard. "Studying?" the boy asked. Richard chuckled. "Trying. I thought maybe if I read enough, I'd understand what happened, how you knew, why Emily came back." Imani shook his head. "You can't read faith in a book. You have to feel it." Richard leaned back, sighing. "That's the part I never learned." "You're learning now," Imani said simply. The words, spoken with such calm certainty, struck Richard more deeply than any book ever could. A few days later, Emily joined her father and Imani for a walk through the city. The cold wind bit at their cheeks, but Emily insisted she was strong enough. They strolled past bustling shops, children laughing as they played in the snow. At one corner, a street musician sat with a battered violin, playing for coins. His music was shaky, but there was heart in it. Imani stopped, listening intently. Then, without hesitation, he knelt beside the man. "Can I play?" he asked softly. The musician blinked, then handed him the violin. Imani lifted it carefully, tucked it beneath his chin, and began to play. The sound that filled the street silenced the crowd instantly. Notes soared into the winter air, rich and alive, weaving warmth into the freezing day. People gathered, their faces softening as the boy's music carried something beyond melody, something healing. When he finished, silence lingered before applause erupted. The musician's eyes filled with tears as he whispered, "You brought life back into these strings." Richard watched, his chest swelling with pride. He saw in the boy not just a miracle, but a force the world desperately needed. That night, back at the mansion, Emily sat with her father by the fire. "Do you think Mom knew all this would happen?" she asked. Richard's eyes flickered with emotion. She believed in impossible things. Maybe she didn't know exactly, but she trusted enough to plant the seed. "And we watered it," Emily whispered. Richard smiled faintly, looking toward Imani as he tuned the piano. "No," he said softly. "He did. And because of him, we'll never stop." Winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow melted from Boston's streets, and the garden at the Lancaster mansion began to bloom again. Flowers lined the walkways, orchids, camellias, daisies, all carefully tended by Imani, who treated each plant as though it carried a prayer. Emily joined him often, crouching carefully with her still healing legs. She loved watching the way his hands moved, gentle yet purposeful, coaxing life from the soil. "You always know which flowers to pick," she said one morning, brushing dirt from her palms. "It's not about picking," Imani replied. "It's about listening to what they're saying." Emily tilted her head. "Flowers don't talk." "They do," he said softly. "Just not with words." Richard, listening from the veranda, smiled faintly. The boy had a way of turning simple things into lessons that even adults struggled to grasp. One evening, Richard gathered both Emily and Imani in the living room. A fire flickered warmly in the hearth. He cleared his throat, nerves making his voice rough. "I've been thinking a lot about promises," he began. "Elaine once told me that promises are like seeds. They only grow if you nurture them. I failed her promise for a long time." His voice cracked. "But I want to make a new one now, to both of you." Emily and Imani exchanged a glance, waiting. Richard stood, his shoulders trembling with emotion. "I promise I will never let money or fear or pride make me forget what really matters again. You," his eyes moved between them, "are my purpose now." Emily's eyes filled with tears. She rushed forward, hugging him tightly despite her frail frame. "That's all I ever wanted, Dad." Imani stood quietly, then stepped closer. He placed a small daisy into Richard's hand. "Then keep this, so you never forget." Richard held the flower carefully, as if it were the most valuable thing he had ever owned. The next week, the three of them returned to the hospital, not as patients, but as visitors. They carried bouquets for other families sitting in waiting rooms, strangers clinging to hope the way Richard once had. Angela, the nurse who had stood by them, met them in the hallway. Her eyes shone as she embraced Emily. "You're the reason I still believe in what I do," she whispered. Emily smiled softly. "Then keep believing, because someone else out there needs you the way I needed you." As they left, Richard lingered in the quiet ICU hallway. He stared at room 706, now occupied by another patient. His reflection glimmered faintly in the glass. For a moment he bowed his head, whispering, "Thank you." When they stepped back into the spring air, Emily reached for her father's hand, and on his other side, Imani walked quietly, a flower tucked in his coat pocket. Together they were no longer broken pieces. They were a family stitched back together by faith. Spring deepened into summer, and with it came a rhythm of life the Lancasters hadn't known in years. Emily's laughter filled the halls, piano music echoed through the mansion, and Richard discovered the joy of slowing down, of being present. One Sunday morning, Richard drove Emily and Imani back to the Roxbury church. This time there was no secrecy, no sneaking past guards. They were welcomed like family. Children ran to greet Imani, clinging to his arms. Reverend Martha smiled at Richard with approval. "You've changed," she told him quietly after the service. Richard nodded, humility softening his once proud features. "I finally learned to listen." Later that afternoon, the congregation gathered in the courtyard for music. Emily sat at the piano with Imani beside her. Her fingers still trembled on the keys, but the notes that came out were filled with life. Together, they played a melody that lifted the spirits of everyone present. An elderly woman whispered, "That's not just music, that's healing." Richard stood in the back, his heart swelling. He realized he no longer needed skyscrapers or boardrooms to feel powerful. This, watching his daughter live, watching the boy he now called his son bring joy to strangers, was enough. That evening, as they drove back to the mansion, Emily leaned against the window, watching the city lights flicker by. "Dad," she said softly, "when people ask about what happened to me, what should I tell them?" Richard glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Tell them the truth." "But what truth?" she pressed. "That sometimes," Richard said, his voice firm but gentle, "God sends us help in ways we don't expect, and sometimes the smallest voice carries the greatest hope." Emily nodded, her eyes flicking toward Imani, who sat quietly beside her, a faint smile on his lips. Weeks passed and summer bloomed in full. The Lancaster garden became a place of gathering. Neighbors stopped by just to listen to the piano drifting through the windows or to sit among the flowers that Imani tended with devotion. One afternoon, Richard found him crouched by a bed of lilies, lost in thought. "What are you thinking about?" Richard asked, stepping closer. Imani looked up, his eyes thoughtful. "About promises. I used to think they were just words, but they're not. They're roots. They keep you grounded when storms come. Richard's throat tightened. And do you feel rooted now? Imani's gaze softened. Yes, because I finally belong. Richard crouched beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You've always belonged. We just had to find each other. The boy smiled faintly, then handed Richard a flower. Then, this is for you, so you don't forget again. Richard held it carefully, his heart swelling. For once, he didn't feel like a billionaire or a broken man. He simply felt like a father. As autumn returned, the Lancasters prepared for a new season of life. Emily was officially cleared by her doctors to return to school part-time. Though her body was still fragile, her spirit shone brighter than ever. She walked into the classroom with her head high, carrying not just books but the strength of a survivor. At home, Richard adjusted to his new role as a father of two. The mansion, once ruled by schedules and silence, now brimmed with warmth. Meals were shared together. Evenings were filled with piano music or quiet talks in the garden. One evening, Richard gathered Emily and Imani in the living room. The fire flickered warmly, and the piano sat silently in the corner. Richard's voice carried a weight of sincerity. I used to think success was measured in numbers, he began, but now I know it's measured in moments, and these, he gestured to the two of them, are the greatest moments of my life. Emily leaned against him, smiling. That's all I ever wanted, to have you back. Imani sat quietly, his eyes shining. And I just wanted a place to belong. Richard's voice cracked as he whispered, You both gave me that too. A week later, they returned once more to the Roxbury Church, this time not for prayer or flowers, but for a dedication. A new wing of the church had been restored in Elaine's memory, filled with plants, music, and space for children to learn. A plaque at the entrance read, For every promise waiting to be believed. As the congregation gathered, Richard stepped forward with Emily and Imani at his side. He spoke not as a businessman, but as a man changed. My wife believed in impossible things, he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. I called it foolishness, but today I stand here to say she was right, because her faith saved me, saved my daughter, saved my son. The crowd erupted in gentle applause. Reverend Martha wiped tears from her eyes, whispering, Elaine's legacy lives on. That evening, as the three of them walked home beneath the autumn leaves, Emily slipped her hand into her father's. On his other side, Imani walked quietly, a small bouquet of wildflowers in his hands. Dad, Emily said softly, do you think miracles end? Richard looked at her, then at Imani, who met his gaze with calm certainty. He shook his head. No, they don't end. They grow. They change shape. But they never really end. Emily smiled faintly, leaning against him. Then I guess we're living one. For the first time in years, Richard felt no fear of the future. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with music, with flowers, with faith, and with family. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, a quiet calm settled over the house. Elon and his son sat together in the living room, the weight of everything they had been through lingering like a soft, unspoken presence. The boy's eyes, still wide with curiosity and innocence, met Elon's with a depth that seemed far beyond his years. You know, Dad, the boy said softly, all the things we've seen, and all the things people expect us to do, none of it matters as much as this moment. He held up his small hand, and Elon took it gently in his own. Being here, talking, feeling, understanding each other. That's what matters. Elon's eyes welled with emotion. For so long he had been focused on grand ideas, missions to Mars, innovations that could change the world. But in that moment, it was clear to him that the greatest mission was right here, right now. The mission of love, connection, and presence. I see that now, Elon replied, his voice thick. I've been chasing everything else, thinking I had to do it all perfectly. But I forgot the most important part, just being with you, listening, learning, sharing. He paused, swallowing hard, trying to hold back the surge of gratitude and love that threatened to spill over. The boy smiled, a small, serene smile that made the room feel warmer than any sunlight. "Jesus told me something once," he whispered, almost as if afraid to break the quiet. "He said that the greatest strength is love, and the bravest thing is to forgive. If we do that, everything else becomes easier." Elon felt a shiver run down his spine, not because of the words themselves, but because of the clarity they brought. In all the complexity of his life, the fame, the pressure, the constant chase for more, he realized that love and forgiveness were the forces that truly mattered. They were simple yet powerful beyond measure. For a long moment, they sat together, hands clasped, hearts aligned. The world outside continued to spin, indifferent and relentless, but inside this small room, time seemed to pause. They had come full circle, through fear, doubt, confusion, and challenge, and now stood in a place of understanding. Finally, the boy yawned, curling into Elon's side. "We don't have to do everything today, Dad. Just this is enough." Elon kissed the top of his son's head, whispering, "Yes, my boy, just this is more than enough." And as night fell, enveloping them in its gentle embrace, Elon understood something he had never fully grasped before, that the most extraordinary journey in life wasn't about reaching the stars or changing the world. It was about opening your heart, sharing your life, and loving without hesitation. And in that quiet, sacred moment, they both knew that they had found something far greater than any achievement or dream. They had found each other, and in that, everything else truly began.